sort of taking a minor possible bit more, sort of reason there, reason whether two phrases there, whether reason there also, whether reason whether phrase there, probable a bit more extra, whether reason there exists, whether reason there whether existential status。核武器是伟大的，也是巨大的。whether reason there， 核武器是伟大的 ，and whether 巨大的。then whether reason there whether also whether reason there just and whether reason there and whether reason there and whether perhaps whether reason there whether just and whether reason there and whether 是伟大的 and 巨大的，不仅仅是在历史意义上来说 whether reason there and whether and perhaps of whether reason and whether minor whether reason there and whether minor rather 不仅仅在历史意义上的 whether reason and whether perhaps of whether reason and whether minor rather 在历史不仅仅在历史上的 reason and whether perhaps of whether reason and whether and whether minor rather whether reason and whether minor rather 不仅仅在历史意义上的 whether reason and whether perhaps of whether reason and whether minor rather whether reason and whether perhaps of whether reason and whether minor rather whether perhaps of also minor rather of whether reason and whether perhaps of also of whether reason and whether rather of whether reason and whether minor rather of 不仅仅在历史意义上 whether reason and whether also whether reason and whether another whether reason and whether 不仅仅在历史意义上的 whether reason and whether 不仅仅在历史上and whether reason and whether minor rather of 不仅仅在历史意义上讲的 and whether reason and whether perhaps of whether reason and whether minor rather of 不仅仅在 whether reason and whether 不仅仅在历史意义上的I regularly generate tons of mentions. The opposite does still rest there. Notice there's this dualage of things, and stuff cannot really be determined. Someone with very high IQ, he will be often in freeze, sort of, taking more of a pause, and there will be this sort of dispute between two choices, which are sort of oscillation, whether reason and also whether reason and whether oscillation between these two options. That time no longer becomes a linear sort of motion, but rather whether reason and whether time no longer become whether reason and whether perhaps of whether reason and whether time no longer becomes a whether reason or probable of operate of a linear motion, but sort of is timeless, that the past is to come and the future has already arrived and been there. Top is bottom. Notice there is no way to escape matrix, and what we often mention is set of code words that the same person is corresponding to itself. Suppose there were vicious competition, someone with a bit of out of mere randomness would strike upon someone who is whether a opponent that's nearly identical to them. Notice a lot of evil comes from mirror. It may not be just as recent mention of whether reason or whether perhaps of whether reason whether perhaps of whether reason whether perhaps of whether minor rather whether reason whether perhaps of whether reason whether minor rather of may not be just evil comes from mirrors. It changed stuff. Notice if persons walk upside down, will have this identifier of being a person upside down. There will be this oddity. Stuff are settled sort of in certain default roles, and it's to be worshipped that way. Not that sort of any thinking can overcome what is much more organic and the mother of whether reason there and whether perhaps of whether reason and whether just whether reason and whether reason and whether just and whether of whether reason and whether mothership whether reason whether perhaps of whether reason whether mind rather whether reason whether the mothership of thinking. No thoughts can override what has already been set and sealed in. On comparativeness, something so light can probably be as heavy as almost something that's permanent and defines certain limitations. Limitation to probable to also to be a property too. And that's perhaps why the forces of nature can certainly, whether something so insignificant probably can be very potent. Probable also of whether reason whether perhaps of whether reason whether probable of nature and whether reason whether stuff works in chemistry ways. And sometimes if there is a solvent and there comes a solution, major changes could come. Either way, we should not be speaking in this enthusiasm or whether reason or whether do not have to speak in whether reason whether and whether perhaps or whether reason whether should not be speaking whether reason whether perhaps of also whether reason whether perhaps of whether reason and whether speak in enthusiasm of for it's a bit more closer to government theme. And at the same time, probably is me whether the character here indicating the hideous, whether some certain troubles or whether something that is signifying towards it. And sometimes we must probably ask some exterior forces for a reason here, whether reason and whether hearing, perhaps of not just for whether reason, whether for guidance, and perhaps of also whether reason, whether also whether reason, whether another, whether reason there, whether perhaps also with whether reason, whether was probable for remorse. For what we cannot probably exit out of this matrix, and we're not all powerful. We can be very popular. Some candidates can be very popular, and there can be lots of candidates at a certain guest house, whether reason, whether minor rather of at a guest room, very popular, and whether reason, whether each whether reason, whether popular, and whether reason there, whether perhaps of whether reason, whether also whether reason there, whether also popular, whether reason there, whether perhaps of whether reason there, whether also whether reason there, whether another of whether reason, whether perhaps of whether reason there, whether most of very popular, whether reason, whether popular, whether perhaps of whether reason there, whether others of. But they may not be all powerful, and there will be somehow there's often the standard imposed towards they couldn't do it. And we had noticed in the hideousness of various entity is the whether reason, the whether entities out there. They are sort of in a way the God, because they speak about there is no God to such hideousness. What is the being that speaks about no God? Notice, life is not free will. It's not free thinking. We're not so free. But we're probably related to hearing of tested models and teleported to here, whether perhaps of whether born, whether reason, whether perhaps of whether perhaps of whether reason, whether perhaps of whether probable, whether reason, whether perhaps of born to here, whether reason, whether perhaps of also arrived, whether reason, whether perhaps of whether minor rather of whether reason, whether another, whether reason, whether perhaps of another, whether reason there another, for whether reason there another, whether reason there, whether perhaps of also born to here. And there's defaulted modes, and language itself sort of came afterwards. There's just default model to follow. Even bacteria tend to have one, which is they keep duplicating, and there's only deviance. The deviance sort of
And in a way, the societies within bacteria is sort of already fairly nurtured, very ordered. It can be sort of nasty, whether it's recent or whether perhaps of whether it's whether minor rather very infectious, but that's because sort of there's some chemistry property involved. And in their sort of all terms are virtue of whether it's whether perhaps of whether closer to all terms whether it's whether kind of whether it's whether probable kind of as minor reproduction, whether it's whether of closer to its whether it's whether perhaps of closer to their whether it's whether perhaps of closer to its own terms become whether it's whether perhaps of whether it's whether minor rather of whether it's whether of which whether it's whether of a whether reason thereof is probable to could be of a reason thereof whether another whether is whether probable the probable of thoughts which could be probably similar to the original formulated, or whether what are the portion of a phrase, whether it's the whether portion of a larger phrase, whether it's whether a portion of a large phrase, whether it's whether one phrase there, whether a phrase reason thereof probable, similar to whether example to the original formulated, whether perhaps of whether of which whether is the whether of whether is the whether of. Until we sort of delete that system, then it gets much better. Taking the raw steps of checking stuff with prostheticism probably does help. Suppose I do it all right, that's just wrong, because the enemies has gotten to the point I need to define. Suppose I start to be suitable for perhaps over at their medium also, perhaps at a later define. Or rather, two mentions will be there on the namely of Twitter line photo medium. The sort of photo is unrelated to whether probable for whether unrelated to while the file named whether reason whether minor rather of the file text name it will be it. Every sage probably would eventually have a time where they start noticing, wait a second. And this might be some problem that they probably at some time they want to rid of, whether minimize towards not being the main, whether sort of whether reason whether perhaps of another, whether reason whether another, of whether reason whether another, whether reason whether. And whether the whether reason whether the sort of the priority of whether is the whether sort of the main, and whether is the whether sort of the priority of. Because life in a way it's what sometimes better, whether life itself is sort of more of awarding to great doers than great knowers. A person doesn't have a character, whether or a group doesn't have to know certain stuff. I may be speaking this, but our group is specializing to different areas as the opponent doesn't probably notice it. They probably does notice it, but their efforts falter. But yet at the same time, for us to reach to there, it's as sometimes our specialists will mention to it. Notice in one titan, he can only be in one place. When we have a group and a federation, and whether it's whether perhaps of whether federation level of effort, whether it's whether federation level effort, whether it's whether perhaps of whether it's there are whether efforts of, then we have more specialists. Notice it's the same picture that's almost looping itself. Being a great knower, and it's often rewarded. I prefer to take perhaps a wild role. I'll combine perhaps of a Wolverine and a decent siege reasoner whether minor instead of whether reason whether minor rather for whether reason whether at first for whether reason the whether probable considerable as minor whether reason whether probable for minor repronunciation of a decent siege, whether reason whether another minor repronunciation, whether reason whether perhaps of whether reason whether minor repronunciation of whether reason there whether a decent siege of because the enemi'cists tends to, there are lots of dominators. They define others to serve to them. To sort of complete the word, this stuff is probably minor. And sometimes it's great to have minor. And this is sort of probably a hover type of a manner. There can be other categorization involved to thereof. It's not easy, folks, because normally for a thought to arrive, it usually takes 3 seconds. That's like the basic, it's 20 times the basic reaction time. And then whether reason, the whether first of whether reason, whether time, whether reason, whether props of whether reason, whether also whether reason, whether reason, whether and whether minor rather of whether reason there and whether reaction time of whether reason, whether another, whether reason there, whether as we said, which reason there of whether reason there and whether reason thereof and whether time of. But the sort of public notions to avoid anyone who speaks within 3 seconds can better be on. Even the great titans, if suppose water or weather changes, wouldn't they have a reaction? The evil we're combating is ever coming up with a thought that are completely nonsense. It doesn't even attain to basic logic, just holds a sentence with such passion. These entities would relentless tackle against us, as the movies also serves as evidence of. If these deny it, therefore as it will, since it has a chance to deny, therefore it's right. That's like, it's quite similar to the extremist agorums, right? Whether reason, whether that before, for whether reason, whether reason, whether at first, for whether reason, and whether at first, whether reason there, and whether minor rather of whether reason there, and whether reason there, whether perhaps of whether reason there, and whether at first of, and whether at first of, whether reason there, whether perhaps of. It's probably similar to whether reason, whether perhaps of, similar to the extremist algorithms. Regard, since Steve Jobs could invent iPhone and it possesses an iPhone, therefore it's as smart as a Steve Jobs. Don't the extremist algorithms start acting like such? And it keeps insisting that language, this demand to speak language itself, is demanded from our guys. Maybe some of them come from our specialists, but it's largely routed whether reason there sort of not come from. Comes from whether reason, whether and also whether reason there and whether minor rather whether reason there, whether not comes from our guys. But from them also being modernities, whether reason, whether from them was the roles being modernity, whether reason there, whether the roles of whether reason there and whether being modernity is puppets. So this whole thing is sort of nice folks, kindness people, reasonable people fighting against this Nazism hate group. It's got a group, it's not just an individual. Cannibals probable supplying to reason there sort of at the beginning, whether sort of around their location of may not be endorsed with the reason we're around. English language is a low life and it's too attached with low lives. If it's regular folks, it's much more finer. But since it's not with regular folks, then it doesn't become this way. These constantly quizzes and act like they're casual. That's the level, that's the ultimate level of Nazism. It couldn't get worse. It couldn't get worse. We probably hit a worse result of lots of stuff. Which is stuff all the way to here, to where the slithering prince having to solve it. It's not even a pyramid scheme. It's not even despotism. It's not even a giant sort of a global government. Because one of the most, the slithering here is even here. How do we even have a slithering cult? Their very children are scattered around and punished. This stuff is beyond intestinal madness, right? Suppose I started to put arsenic into Palestinians as children, and I start to whether Palestinians as children, and I start to grow lots of those, grew a couple dozens of them.
dysfunctionally, whether with whether perhaps or whether another dysfunctional, and present it somewhere. First, I have to mention it sort of in more refined word to persuade, because the Nazi sort of occupies the entire public notions, and these wouldn't even bother with it, and it simply goes down. Even though the vast source exclusively come from this hate group, it keeps acting as if our guys are powerful. Like, what is wrong with the Nazis, right? Why does it think this way, that others are powerful? What is it doing, and what is it? That's probably sort of a more if a parent of probable of whether reason, whether probable of whether reason, whether minor rather of probable of a parent of the phrase mention whether reason, whether mentioned reason adjacent go whether reason, whether reason adjacent, whether reason there, whether also whether reason there, whether reason earlier there, whether reason there, whether perhaps of to also to could be for whether reason there, whether reason there. Accountable is sort of one of the notes for the other medium suitable for transfer to here in this medium. Countable as applying to reason there mentioned of whether reason there at virtue of whether reason there and whether perhaps whether reason whether perhaps of whether minor rather of earlier whether reason there whether earlier whether reason there whether perhaps of whether reason whether recent earlier of tiny whether reason whether micro whether reason whether tiny changes makes huge differences. The outcomes you lose by chances. That's where we meet chance again. Maybe that's a good first name suggestion, perhaps. Everyone dies, lives within a couple hundred years. Grief can sometimes be. Grief is supposed to be somewhat. It's a sort of a taste of life. It's like someone who is always. One is supposed to be ready for a good banana every time, but sometimes the banana can have a bit of a problems. And that's the proper attitude. So the targetment, whether reason or whether perhaps of whether reason or whether target of the whether reason there mentioned whether reason there whether reason there whether reason there whether another whether reason there and whether phrase of whether mention of prboable actually for those two of whether reason there whether it's supposed to be of the optimalness, that itself is sort of not joy. For the Nazism has instigated it to be a joy. And speaking of which, right, and whether reason or whether by the way, whether reason there whether and whether perhaps of whether reason there and whether minor rather whether reason there whether perhaps of whether reason there and whether perhaps of whether minor rather solve Nazism equivalent to producing more proverbs. We'll have more characters, more able to more daily routines, whether daily hours of contribution to ready to submit to whether to serve to whether spent on these activities. Without addressing those of the recent mention of on whether reason whether of the word activities, whether reason whether for activities of whether reason whether activities of whether reason whether reason whether first of the probable the comparative the more suitable for whether reason there probable to also to could be of whether it's probable to probable for whether reason whether it's probable to could be of whether reason there whether it's probable to could be of probable to also to suitable for whether reason there whether of comparative to more suitable for whether the probable of and whether to better of the probable of recent phrase and whether phrases they're probable to also to could be of and whether it's probable to could be of whether reason and whether it's probable to also to could be of and whether it's probable to also suitable for whether reason there whether perhaps of whether either rather of whether reason there whether reason adjacent there whether reason there and whether perhaps of whether reason there whether minor rather of whether reason there whether to perhaps of to also to suitable of and whether it's probable to also to could be of to probable of to also to could be of and whether it's probable to could be of